70 people already, and I think, consider it is 1 o'clock on a Monday, I'll start with my flim flam to just welcome you along. This is uh, an overview of the budget that was announced last week. Um, what I do want to say is this is not necessarily my unique and thought through advice. I've an analysis on this. I've kind of nicked a lot of good ideas from other people as well. I think it's always helpful to do that when you've got an issue as complex as the budget itself. So what I'll try and do is give you a general overview of kind of some of the headlines from the budget, but I'll be focusing on what we think this says about the economy over the next few years. I'll then focus on some elements of tax, which isn't usually a massive issue for the voluntary sector, but certainly is going to be with this year's budget and national insurance
1 minute
contribution.
delay.
Then we start looking at public spending and where the public spending's like to be and where it's likely to be not, and some issues around Greater Manchester and a bit of a summary. One thing I would do is I'll be talking first. I've got about 13 slides, so that should give you. I've probably got content for half an hour there. But I'm always really interested to see if anybody's got any insight on some of these issues as well. I'm a bit of a generalist, so can't really give you kind of in-depth information on whether some of the elements of spending are sufficient or insufficient. And it'd be really good to see if these people, and I certainly can see from the attendance list, there are some experts amongst you there who might have a better view. So I think what we'll do is I'll do my bit. Do put comments in the chat if you do have any views that you think are particularly of interest, any questions. I'm probably not the best person to answer questions at the end of it because I can't speak for the government on its budget. But if there's anything we can help with, and especially with the wise heads in the room, I'm sure we can get some insight there. So if I start moving over to the general overview of the budget, I think what's really important to say here is there's a significant increase in public spending here that perhaps wasn't anticipated before the budget was announced, and it was actually quite surprising in that sense. Um, there's also quite an investment in capital as well in terms of buildings and rebuilding and construction. And that is something that's been missing, especially for the last 14 years, really. And we've seen a deterioration in the public realm, a deterioration in the schools, in hospitals. And you can now start seeing an attempt to start getting back at that kind of backlog of maintenance, repairs and investment. There's also, accompanying that significant increase in public spending, a significant increase in taxation, and quite a bit of it moving on to employers, and we'll come to that a little bit later. There's always a lot of talk from chancellors how budgets need to be costed. I don't think that's really quite true in essence. It's recognizing spending puts money into the economy, taxation takes it out, and sometimes if you're worried about inflation, you do need those things to balance. So I think, as we'll say, the taxation doesn't necessarily cover all the budget costs, but it will kind of dampen down parts of the economy as certain parts of the economy are boosted as well. I think it's also needs to understand that significant cuts were made in previous budgets. And although we've seen a massive boost to spending, it doesn't mean that that boost to spending will restore all that's been lost. I'm not sure you could do that in one fell swoop, really. Important to also recognise that this is a budget that gives a projection of spending for the next 5 years, the term of this government until the next election. There's a big boost in spending in the first year. There's not really boosts in spending the years after. It's more kind of this is the boost, and it's kind of maintained or even kind of dampened down a little bit later on. What this might be unfair calling it a bet, but this is a commitment to growth and reform. There's a real view that this is a budget that puts money into areas that could actually help with economic growth, but also there's a real commitment to kind of reforming public services there. And I'll kind of come through to those as we go through on the certain elements of it. So Just on the economy, I've got a few slides here that I've nicked from, and by the way, this presentation will be shared by anybody who booked on, so don't need to worry about the slides in that regard. This is from the Office of Budget Responsibility's own guide to the budget. And just to explain this, there's a chart there on your screen where years along the bottom. In each bar, the yellow one is what the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, thought would be the case in March, based on the last government's figures. If you followed the news over the summer, the new government came in, opened the books and found a missing 22 billion. The OBR changed its forecast, and that's the middle bar. So that's if the government hadn't done anything different at this budget. This is the OBR view of growth, in that it's kind of actually up a little bit this year, but down a little bit next year, and then it kind of continues on at a kind of below 2% for the rest of the period. This dark blue bar on the chart is what's happened after the budget in terms of the OBR's view. So that's a big boost to growth in the next financial year, but that then kind of tails off. So growth is actually below what it would have been otherwise. So that's the OBR basically saying there's almost like a sugar rush of this increased spending has a big spike to growth, but then it kind of dies back a little bit. If we actually look at where the growth is, again, I'll be showing this so you can look at this. And these are the OBR's view. That boost has come from public spending and government investment, kind of putting more money into the economy. But what they do believe is that money will also be going out of the economy. So this kind of greyish blue bar is they think that the increase in taxation will take money out of people's pockets and private consumption will go down as government spending increases. This orange bar is reductions in trade. And that is the Office of Budget Responsibility saying that's the impact of leaving the European Union, that trade reduces. There's been a lot of talk about the impact of Brexit already. The impact of Brexit really hasn't started on the economy. It's a slow puncher that will take place for a number of years, really reducing the amount of trade that's there. This purple bar is interesting, though. It's the OBR basically saying because government is investing, the private sector won't. That's partly because they think there's less money to be made because people have less money in their pockets, and partly because they think that sometimes government investment does what they call crowds out private investment. So that sense of if you're trying to rebuild schools and hospitals, you're using a lot of construction workforce. They're really there for private projects anymore. So the government would actually challenge this, and this is actually quite a pessimistic view of growth. If the government and local authorities and a range of organisations can get more people into work, grow the workforce, that grows the economic capacity of the country. If we can move people from very low paid jobs that don't really have a lot of massive economic impact to better paid jobs, that can actually put money in people's pockets as well. So this is actually kind of a conservative view that kind of growth balances out by the end of in the 3 or 4 and 5th year of this. But if that first few years you can create new kinds of economic activity, actually growth could actually be able to continue, and that increases the amount of money available to the government and to individuals as well. Just a view of inflation. They're saying that they previously believed that inflation would go down even further than it is, but then move up to about 2%. They're now saying the opposite will happen. It'll start to go up to about 2.5, 2.75%, and go down to about 2%. We're not seeing a return to inflation going massively above 10% as it spiked during the cost of living crisis, but it's broadly stable, but running a little bit higher than predicted. And that's assumed because of the big increase in spending, putting money into the economy and creating demand. And just on interest rates, the government OBR previously expected interest rates to fall to about 3.25% by the end of 2026. It's now thinking it'll fall to about 3.5% by that time. So there's a bit of difference there, slightly higher interest rates. But I think what's really important to realise is we're definitely fixed in an era of interest rates being around that 3.5% level, whereas before the cost of living crisis, it was below 1%. Or 1% and 1% below. So it's a different kind of environment where money costs more and investment costs more and borrowing costs more. And that's here to stay, although it will be lower levels than we've seen as following the cost of living crisis. So again, it's that sense of this spending has a bit of an impact. how people will notice that and whether it actually comes to pass is another thing. The Bank of England will be issuing their rates forecast after this at the next Monetary Policy Committee. I think there's one this month. So we'll get a sense of whether the Bank of England think interest rates are going to be at that level as well. But that does make a difference from, especially GMCVO as a social investor. We do understand the issues around borrowing and interest rates that can affect ability of organisations to borrow money, invest in growth of their own social enterprises or trading activity. But it should be stabilised is the key thing. So as a bit of a summary, it's like growth boosted in the short term, but tailing off a little bit, but still growth there. So it's not the kind of recession and crisis that we've seen in the past. Inflation stable, but slightly higher. Interest rates stable, but slightly higher. But that's all on a set of assumptions about how government spending crowds out private spending. I think the government disagree with that. I probably disagree with it to a certain degree. I think a lot of that will depend on we've got 76% of the population in employment at the moment. If we can move that to 80%, we're increasing the number of people available for work. If we can move people from bad jobs into good jobs and get rid of some of the bad jobs in the economy, that can also make more stable long-term growth a reality. So that's the general economic outlook, which isn't as bad as it's been in some of the recent years, much more stable level of growth, but not really strong growth that really kind of drives that ability to get tax revenue and spend on public services and doesn't really end some of the challenges we've got with low income in the economy. In terms of taxation, I mentioned inheritance tax at the end of this because at the start of this, because it is something that's in the papers at the moment. It's only increasing inheritance tax on bringing pension pots into scope in some farms. It's about tax avoidance measures. Some of the bigger issues, though, are about personal allowances and duty levels frozen. So it's that sense that the level at which you start paying tax is frozen. If because of inflation, that doesn't take into account pay rises, more people will start paying tax and pay tax at higher levels. And the big issue is employers' national insurance contributions increased and the thresholds reduced. So that means that previously it was charged after £9,000 of earnings. Now it's down to £5,000 of earnings. So that's an increase. It's a tax on jobs effectively. But allowances at which an employer can not pay tax have been increased to 10.5k. That basically means that if you've only got a couple of members of staff, you're actually going to be taken out of paying national insurance contributions. And they reckon about nearly 900,000 employers will no longer pay national insurance contributions. I think there's been an estimate of if you've got about six or less staff, your voluntary organisation or community organisation should be out of this scheme. But if you are paying national insurance contributions and you do have more staff, it could lead to quite a bill. It's really hard to give an estimate because it depends on your organisation, your pay levels, how many managers versus how many people delivering, and so on. It can be really, really different. Spoken to a couple of organisations, and an organisation with about 30 staff might be paying 20 to 25k a year extra on this, which does, it's not a time when we're swimming in money, so it does have an increase on the cost of doing work. One thing that is clear with this is those national insurance contributions employers won't apply to the public sector. So this does make it a bit more expensive to outsource services out of the public sector, and that could have an impact on appetite for commissioning and actually the prices that we need to charge to actually just cover our costs. Um, so the overall impact is NCVO, the National Council of Voluntary Organisations, estimate this will be about 1.4 billion costs to voluntary community organisations. Social care providers, their umbrella body was thinking it's going to be about 2.5 billion pounds of cost. Obviously, there are some organisations in both of those. When challenged about this, Darren Jones, who's the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, kind of the number two at the Treasury behind Rachel Reeves, was because this doesn't just affect voluntary organisations and social care providers, but GPs, universities, on private GP practices rather than the ones under the NHS. It was a sense of, well, they'll just have to pay this. I think he was a bit more reflective about the cost of social care because a lot of the cost of social care is borne by the government. So the government will be is maybe providing more money for social care provision and then having it taxed back. So I think there might be some changes to this scheme. I don't think there'll be an entire opt-out for the voluntary community faith and social enterprise organisations. I think it might be some targeted areas, especially where the public sector's paying for services. It seems odd to increase the amount of spend on public services and then tax it. So I think there may be some changes that emerge over this, but I don't see at this point mass whole-scale opt-outs because this is one of the ways that the government's trying to bring a lot of money in through taxation. But it is something I'd be concerned about for any organisation, as I say, six above six members of staff, and you might start to see some of the costs being quite real for you as an organisation. Just one point I'd say around taxation, I found this graph useful. Over the last 50 years, these are OECD, the organised, these are the high income countries. There's about 33 of them. Tax has been going up as a proportion of the country's economy relatively steadily. And certainly, if you look at from the 2010 figure, the global financial crisis, it's been going up the levels of tax. The fact that we've had over the last 14 years an attempt to keep tax low is we've been out of step with most economies, and this has actually caused a lot of problems in terms of investment in the public realm, in social fabric, and in public services. So we're actually moving a bit more normal, even though there are some kind of shocking headline sensitive shock by saying highest ever tax and highest tax. We're about normal. We're actually a bit below average on high income European nations, so we're not really kind of massively overtaxed as a proportion of the economy compared to others. It is quite a step change compared to what's happened in the last 14 years. It says more about last 14 years than anything else. So in terms of spending, increased by £70 billion a year over the next 5 years. I would I think that's more than many of us could have hoped for, considering the kind of mood music that had happened during the election campaign and after. And roughly about two-thirds of that is services and one-third on investment. And about half is covered by tax and half by borrowing. So when I talked before about that sense of fully costed budgets, that day-to-day spending going up by that two-thirds, that's 70 billion, but only half of that 70 billion being covered by tax shows that the government's actually borrowing to invest in public services as well. Much of this is front loaded. This is the big increase to spend. It'll be maintained, but it won't be going up by inflation over the next few years. The last 3 years of this kind of 5-year settlement show average increases about 1%, and that's with inflation being 2% or just a bit above 2%. So it'll be a sense of this is the big investment in spend, and after that it kind of eases and flattens out. I think what's really important is each department's been given a 2% productivity target, which basically means you've got to do things more efficiently and more cost effectively and find 2% savings a year in your budget. Not quite the same thing as a cost, but it's that sense of you've got to find different ways of delivering this. So in terms of that spend, £22 billion additionally a year for health, just on day-to-day spending, that revenue mentioned, and £3 billion for capital. We know that the state of hospitals is a mess. In many cases, that the kind of issue with the concrete that was crumbling. The thing is, you cannot just flatten and renew all the hospital buildings in one go, and there's not enough workers. There's not enough construction workers for a start, and so the biggest increase has to be in day-to-day spending, and also you can't just close down hospitals and rebuild them and just hang around waiting for the new building to be built. But it is that sense of a start to the renewal of that kind of the infrastructure and structure and the architecture of health delivery. £1.3 billion for local government, but that includes 600 million just on social care. So if you think back to where social care providers were saying that they'd have to pay increased tax of 2.5 billion, there's only £600 million increased in spending. So that circle's got to be squared at some point. There's a big spend on city region sustainable transport. There's a That's fairly flexible in terms of how transport authorities can deploy that, whether it's through things like bike lanes, or some have used that to actually increase the subsidy for fares where the previous government cap wasn't available. £500 million for road maintenance. Whether you're a driver or not, if you use buses, you know that the roads can be in a bit of a state at the moment. It's largely a potholes budget that, and I wouldn't diminish that as an issue that's important to the electorate. You do know if the roads are not in good repair with many journeys. So it's attempt to address the backlog of repair work and maintenance work that hasn't been undertaken in the last decade or so. The bus fare cap, that where it's existed from the government, it's been £2. It's raised to £3. We won't see any change in Greater Manchester because some of that is already covered by local spending anyway. And Greater Manchester, because of the franchising approach, it's the way the costs are structured are slightly different from other kind of more deregulated areas of the country. So it's a sense of that might be a big issue in other parts of the country, but we'll still see that £2 fare cap in Greater Manchester. You may, if you've followed the budget, seen a lot of talk about rail schemes. There isn't a single new pound associated with rail schemes. That was the government re-announcing and committing to previous schemes. I don't think that's a terrible thing to do, since one of the biggest transport announcements in the last couple of years was actually walking away from a commitment to HS2. So there is that sense that the government is recommitting to rail schemes. I think what's really important is the UK Shared Prosperity Fund has been cut by 40% from 1.5 billion to 0.9 billion. That's 600 million, and that's just in next year. This is really important because UK Shared Prosperity Fund was the funding that replaced European funding. It's there for kind of regeneration work, place-based work, but also a lot of skills work and employment support work has been covered by the Shared Prosperity Fund. And it's the only real source of targeted support for young people who are not in employment, education, training, targeted support for racially minoritized communities, and targeted support for people over 50 at the moment. So the thing is, if that had gone completely, then a lot of targeted employment support would also have been lost as well. But that's still quite a cut of expecting £1.5 billion to spend next year and only getting that 0.9 billion. This will be something that's decided locally in terms of where the money that does come in goes to. So that will be decided at a Greater Manchester level. There was a new announcement of employment support, and there's two programs. There's a £115 million program about support employment for people with disabilities or health conditions, but also £240 million for 16 employment trailblazers. I'd expect Greater Manchester to be well positioned for those employment trailblazers. Whether we have one Greater Manchester one or a couple of districts are including that, we'll see once the details available. But that's 350 million over 5 years. That's 60 million a year compared to a 600 million loss on that Shared Prosperity Fund. There will be a new scheme that replaces the Shared Prosperity Fund announced at the spending review in the spring. So we'll get a sense of where what the kind of spending envelope is and what the vision is for that. So it is that sense of there is a significant cut there, and there is some, again, these trailblazers and pilot schemes, but no real long-term replacement as yet, and we don't know the level of that. £300 million for further education, kind of commitment to the skills agenda. One of the real challenges that further education providers have is the workforce issue. They're struggling to recruit for current roles. They're not going to be able to expand if the providers aren't there. £1 billion for special educational needs in schools. As a primary school governor, I very welcome this. The amount of demand across all age groups has gone up massively in the last few years, and behind most of those is a family in crisis. So it's also good to see that £8 billion on early years and family services as well. The thing is here is this is a bit of an expansion, which is a good thing, but where's the workforce for this? We have a really tight labour market, some real skills gaps in some areas. So although the investment is really welcome, we've just got to then start saying, well, who's actually going to be doing this work? The 250 million on innovation children's care isn't going to fix the problem, but that's a really good commitment to try and do new things. I don't know whether Scott Darragh from Social Adventures is on the call, but it's really interesting what they're doing in Salford on developing a new community-owned children's care home model. And the more money that can go into that kind of scheme, the better. And the more organisations that can also get involved in that. I think in Greater Manchester, about 94% of children's care accommodation is owned by private equity firms, which is just not a good thing at all. And so that's an attempt to try and find a solution. And hopefully, once a solution is found, a bit more investment gets piled in behind that. Spending on Ministry of Justice by 5.6 a year is incredibly unusual. It's the bit that always gets cut, which is why we've had a massive prisons crisis this summer. That includes £2.3 billion for prison expansion. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a new prison in Greater Manchester, which will help people be connected and offenders stay connected with their family, their communities that they come from, which has a greater chance of reducing reoffending and stops them being scattered across the region or nation. But it also means there's potentially going to be a big planning issue in one of the districts this year as well. But so it's seeing that commitment, and especially with policy changes looking at rehabilitation, there's quite a bit of hope there that we can actually reduce that kind of reoffending. And so there's a community safety angle there, but also it's something that the voluntary sector has been really good at in the past. Cuts to the Home Office, though, kind of balancing that out. I think the assumption there is by being much more effective and efficient and less cruel in terms of some of the way asylum cases are processed, savings can be made as well. And it'll be just interesting to see if the Home Office can get a grip of that issue. £500 million on affordable housing, £200 million on homelessness. I'm not an expert in these issues. I'm not sure how sufficient that is, but it's clear that there is an investment there, but it's not in the big billions that we're seeing in some other areas as well. I think when you see these schemes figures nationally, to roughly work out how much Greater Manchester gets, by the way, I'd say look at get 5%. So if you see that £200 million of homelessness, if it was just scattered around the country based on population, you'd be looking at about £10 million of that in Greater Manchester. Obviously, a homelessness package may be more focused on major cities anyways. That's where a lot of homelessness presents itself. So in terms of what happens in Greater Manchester, as I say, we don't know the allocation, so I can't say how much of those different budgets are going, but that kind of, it's always worth thinking about roughly 5% of the population of the UK, so 5% of the budget. Some of this will depend on the integrated settlement, and there's a real commitment to that kind of city region working with the West Midlands and Greater Manchester, but starting to build in other areas as well. And so we expect to have more flexibility on that spending, so it can be moved across to different areas where it comes into the Greater Manchester level. But this is all dependent on negotiation that happens in the near future. And what I say about that is that government will want an outcomes framework, and so we'll still be attaching strings to this money, but perhaps not as much strings as the last government would. No significant capital schemes have been announced for Greater Manchester, but they may follow. So some of the hospital rebuilding schemes around the RAAC concrete, the kind of crumbling concrete, none of those were in Greater Manchester based on the last programme, but announcements may follow there. I think what's really important is just on the wider economy is it's a significant challenge for the hospitality industry. So if you think about a lot of people working in precarious work, minimum wage level, slight increase to the minimum wage as well that was mentioned in the budget, but that those national insurance contributions, running a community centre, running a conference centre as we do, um, there's going to be increased costs to those kind of very labour dependent kind of types of business. And GM Great Manchester has a lot of activity around events and entertainment. It's not just the nighttime economy, but the entire weekend economy can be built around sports events and different forms of entertainment. So there's a sense that those low paid jobs are going to get increased pressure. But that may be not out of the government's mind as it tries to try and create better paid jobs in the economy and kind of move away from a kind of model of economic activity that is based on precarious employment. Those UK SPF cuts in Greater Manchester may be a significant challenge, but there may be some balancing with new employment support initiatives, and that builds into some of the things the mayor's talked about with the Live Well programme, if you're familiar with that. So it's that sense of the overall budget goes, the flexibility is increased, and we may see a bit more support from central government on some of that employment support. But there's no real headlines for Greater Manchester kind of beyond that. And we'll see once the negotiations with the single settlement around devolution come to pass. But as the dust settles on this budget and departments start making announcements, then we'll start to get a bit more detail. And so I think my last slide is I think that was more money on spending than we expected before the budget with the kind of mood music. It reflects a real belief that the government thinks that state can generate growth. So yes, there's an increase in spending, increase in taxation, an increase in borrowing. But if the economy grows at a faster rate than would be the case, that kind of wipes out some of those costs. So it really depends on whether the government is right and the kind of very orthodox Office of Budget Responsibility is wrong in terms of does this kind of spending kind of free up economic capacity? Does it create different ways? Does it create more opportunities? Does it bring in more investment because of the nature of the labour market in the UK? There's a real drive for reform and increased productivity. So I remember that each department having a budget of 2% of productivity improvements it's going to make for that. But in the past, when the last Labour government were in, it was that sense of, oh, we'll use markets and we'll outsource services and get benefits from that. Whereas I think we're seeing at the moment the talk being more about technology. So how do you use technology and automation to reduce costs of things and increase value? So I don't expect this to be a big boom in kind of outsourcing services. As I said before, increasing national insurance contributions on non-public sector spend actually makes it more expensive to outsource and use markets in that sense. The economic outlook doesn't look especially positive. It's better growth than we've seen in the last 5 years, but kind of still below what we'd need to do to catch up. Um, um, Even going back to the global financial crisis in 2010. But as I say, it's based on those assumptions. And one of the questions that I kind of came across into some other spend, where there's an expansion, where's the workforce? We're kind of almost at full employment at the moment. Labour market slack, and the people who could work are either got barriers to work, whether it's because of caring responsibilities, whether it's because of disability, and whether it's because of illness. And are we able to remove those barriers to work to actually enable more people to come and work in some of those areas? And how do we get the skills of that workforce in place? And a lot of that down to policy around immigration and work visas as well, and that limiting the ability of employers to bring in talent from overseas to actually fill skills gaps. And will spending on skills be able to get the workforce to actually meet those skills gaps? And as I say, some of the challenges is the workforce there for the skills providers as well? And I suppose one of the big questions is, and it means there'll possibly need to be a future session like this at some point. This is just the headlines from the budget. This is the kind of spending envelope. We don't really know a lot of the detail until after the spring spending review. And that will basically say as well, this is the spending that's likely to happen over the next 5 years. In the spring, there'll be more details from each department about its priorities and where it's putting the spend. And so this is going to be an ongoing conversation, and more information will come out over time. So if I stop sharing, and now I can actually see people. Um, so while I've been talking, my colleagues Helen from Bolton CVS has just been having a look at the chat. Is there anything that people violently disagree with me about, Helen, or
I wouldn't say violently disagree, no, and I am going to take this opportunity to ask a question about something that I'm not sure of. I think the national insurance hikes, because that's tangible, it's definitely happening. We're not having to wait to see what's coming or wait for further detail. It's something that's very prominent and everyone's thinking about and trying to work out. There was a question in the chat: does anyone know how to work it out? Is the one place to go to do the sums? But also the one thing that I don't know is, have VCFEs ever been treated differently to businesses in terms of national insurance? I'm interested in that. I don't know that has always been the same rule.
I
I don't
think as
know.
far as I'm concerned, I'm aware, not as far as I'm concerned, as far as I'm
Mm,
aware, it's generally always been the same. And that's why I think we're not going to get an opt-out. I
okay.
think it's easier to do, say, central government and public services get an opt-out, but it's much harder to do that for an entire kind of category of employer. And in
Yeah.
many ways, we're treated a bit like the public sector. With private sector, sorry, we're a bit independent of the state in that provision. The state
Mm,
can decide not to tax itself because that would be silly.
yeah.
But the problem would be is if it was basically saying we're not going to, it would have to create a new kind of legislation around charities, similar to that and stuff, and there'd be some complex issues there. And that's why I think the government might be a bit more minded to think about the kinds of services it provides and provide it equally to providers
Mm,
in those. So I think they are going to look at social care. I don't know how much thought they put into it, or whether this was a panic move to try and find some way of getting enough tax to fill a gap. And so I think we'll find out. It's one of those perhaps act in haste, repent at leisure. I would say I think it was the Institute for Fiscal Studies said the government will not raise 25 billion through national insurance contributions, and it'll probably raise closer to 16 billion. So it may need to find a way to raise tax differently anyway. So because it's that sense of, if you put a tax on jobs, some businesses won't create jobs. And actually, it's not
okay.
necessarily a bad thing if we've had too much investment and spend on very precarious, low-paid jobs where we should invest in technology and skilling people. And so there are potential benefits to moving away from that model, but doing it overnight and killing off a number of businesses is tricky. So we'll we'll see as the dust settles. In
Okay.
terms of where you could find out, I don't know of any easy It's so difficult because every organisation is different in terms of its rates of pay and so on, and it's usual that if you've got a finance officer who can do these things, getting them to look at it, whether you've got an independent personnel advisor who are able to do that. If we find a calculator in the meantime, by the time we send the slides out, we'll share that. If anybody's got one, please put it in the chat, please, because I'll use it myself. But it's one of those that is probably more an individual calculation as much as anything else.
Fair enough. We've got a comment from David about the situation leading to less donations to charities from individuals with the higher interest rates and food and fuel prices. Um, and I think that's fair. I don't know if anyone's seen any information anywhere saying that that's not likely.
And yeah, I think at times of growth, people are more willing to look outside their own family circumstances and look, and when things are they're kind of constrained, and people are worried, it's a bit more. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that continuing. You kind of need a bit more optimism in the economy for that to happen. But I think we've just got to start adjusting to a world with interest rates at 3.5%, where it's been 1%, 0% effectively.
Okay. Mike was asking about if anyone's got any sense of how that 22 billion investment into health, into social care might actually be done.
And this is the problem with budgets. It's the big numbers. We
Mm.
need now to actually have that sense of what the how the department's going to react and what it's going to invest in. We've heard the Secretary of State West Streeting talk about greater use of technology, wanting to move into prevention and away from treatment. So I can imagine that there'll be some attempts at pushing some of that money into, can you do something to reduce demand, not just meet demand? There is still a massive waiting list and a backlog that I think they'll have to put money into treatment to deliver. But I think the challenge again is, where's the workforce? Because we've actually lost a lot of skilled people out of both our organisations and the NHS itself in terms of meeting some of those backlogs of needs. So it's not always the money. If you've not got the investment in the workforce to get your future talent in position, how do you retrain people to undertake new programs? So I think it's going to be a challenge. But again, I think coinciding with this, the comprehensive spending review in the spring, there was definitely a case that the government were thinking about its health plans to be made more clear by around March time. So I think that's when we'll get a sense of where the NHS is going. I don't know how much of this will be emergency spending to plug gaps versus, right, here's the programme. But I would expect again, around a proper health plan to be more in the spring after some of the announcements that have been made. It was always that sense of, we're saying the NHS is broken now and something radical needs to happen. We'll tell you what that is in a few months' time rather than straight after the budget.
Mm. Okay. So we might be able to run a similar session after the spring update.
Yes.
Um, Rachel Summerscales has got some really interesting update about community-led housing. Rachel, I don't know if you are here or if you'd be willing to talk that through, or you want me to read out your comment.
Oh, um, well,
Thanks, Rachel.
can you hear me, Helen and John?
Yes,
Hi, yeah.
yep.
I mean, really, it was just that we had a meeting at GMCVO about the GM Accord a few months ago about the single settlement, and we talked about on our table looking at housing about the need for like a dedicated fund for community-led housing and small sector housing. So for us, although the main budget really doesn't impact on community-led housing, because the affordable homes 500 million is not enough to support the dreams of the government in terms of creating all this affordable housing because our build costs are so high. So I don't know what they'll do about that. There's a big worry in the sector, but the single settlement could really make a difference for us in housing. And I'm thinking, you know, in other sectors in within the VCSE sector as well, it could make a big difference, and we should perhaps keep up to speed. You know, my feeling is that we talked about devolution for years ago, and then it all went quiet. And I think I felt a bit skeptical about it all, but perhaps it could be made to work harder for us. And just to note that, yeah, North York's Council have just announced £1 million a year for the next 3 or 5 years. Specific is grant funding for community-led housing. I mean, this is massive for one council to do. These sorts of figures would make a huge difference. So, yeah.
And I think that's probably the way to think about it, that the capacity of local government to actually think up things and do things differently and not just focus on the emergencies has been increased because of this. They will still need to put their own capacity in place to manage it. But I think this is the good time now for us to start thinking, especially can point at something that somebody else has done that says, that's possible, why can't we do it here? Because you're not asking people to make a massive leap of imagination at that. But I think over the next few months, before the spring spending announcement is a good time to actually start talking with local authorities and talking with the GMCA about what's possible and what's practical and what can be put in to address some of these issues. So we know that the resource will be there to do more than plug gaps, even though I agree that some elements of it, I knew the 500 million would be insufficient, but it's just how insufficient it would be, I suppose, at the end of the day. But I think it's that sense of we can be hopeful about trying new approaches. It won't fix all the problems in one go, but it's better than it could have been, and it won't just be about just doing the emergency stuff. But can the work be done to actually reduce demand caused by the social economic environment and some of the kind of failure demand that has occurred over the last few years, and especially after COVID as well. And that's why I think the 22 billion on health is really important. Can it clear the debts? Can it invest?
So I suppose on that, John, I was thinking also that we need to try and use that power of devolved budgets to, people saying how will they, that we're saying that our sector can't be exempt from the national insurance rises, which won't affect a lot of us because we're very small, but it will affect the more bigger and powerful people in the room who are delivering services. You could just imagine if GM set a precedent for saying they would support that. It's like we've got that power. We have to fight for it, but we can do that because of devolution, can't we? We can
Yeah.
fight back against central government. It sounds mad to say I want to fight a Labour government, but hey.
The key thing is just being practical about what's there. And I think I just noticed there a point that Mike Wild's made about the timescales and the sustainability plans there. You can't just dump all this money into the system. Solutions are going to need to be found, and I suppose this the challenge is that small scale problems aren't going to create large scale solutions unless there's lots of them that are kind of glued together. So we need to show how much some of this stuff can do to prevent demand. That I mean, they should talk about employment support. They talk about the need to get 150,000 people in Greater Manchester in employment to actually get up to the kind of levels the government would want to see. And if if you try to get 150,000 people to work, you probably need to be working with 400,000 to 500,000 altogether. That's not a small program with 20 people. You've got to be able to really produce this at scale. Just in terms of I think Rebecca Tremodo also just made the point that the budget this is about the 5 year spending. So it includes this financial year, and most of these figures are for kind of ongoing. Some of them are more one-off, and that's the Shared Prosperity Fund cut is definitely because that's just next year. Because it doesn't cut from this year, but it's extended for another year with a cut. But most of these spending plans it is for next year, but there is some this year it starts. A good example was the bus fare cap starts from the 1st of January.
But so the national insurance rise, because I think a lot of us are trying to look at immediate finance implications that are going to make huge differences. I know that's what we're worried about. That's from the 1st of April that we'd start calculating that, is it?
Yes, as far as I'm aware, yes. The taxation generally kicks in once people have had that time to adjust rather than immediately. Spending something they can be a bit more flexible about.
And I've noticed somebody's put a couple of calculations in the chat for looking at that national insurance, and Mike said that he has got a spreadsheet that he could share that maybe we could send around with the slides as well. Okay. I think that we have tackled most of the in the chat. Unless anyone has
I think
anything.
an announcement was made last Thursday kind of does create more questions and answers. One of the reasons why we didn't do this kind of briefing on the Friday would be I'd be making even more shrugs at that point, and I've had the weekend to look at the newspapers and some of the analysis that's been coming out. So some things will become clearer over time. The government will clarify things. The government may make adjustments to some of those policies, but this is the kind of direction, at least. This is the kind of broad sweep of things. I wouldn't expect massive changes to it, but as we've seen over the last few years, governments can make U-turns quite quickly when pushed, and some of this may fall apart in the delivery, but we are where we are, and we know what we know, I suppose, is the key.
Yeah, and we can hope that we can see more decisions being made now. We've got a little bit of certainty, I'd like to think. Everybody who's been waiting to make decisions can make them now, and we can all crack on.
Yes.
Okay. That was super useful. Okay. Thank you for that insight, John. Appreciate it. There's lots of clapping and cheering happening.
There's very rarely clapping and cheering after a budget, but there we go. Thank you all for your attendance, and good luck.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.